If you like what you're hearing, you can support me on Patreon, patreon.com/mtgbooks, or just search me up, Phil Dawson. Thank you. Chapter 20. Trial. She vanished in the wink of an eye. Even against the constant stabbing brightness of the energy stream, the flash of Krovak's departure with Belby was intense. Urza felt the displaced air and excess power lap over him, a whisper against a roar. He rolled onto his hands and knees and began to crawl. It was a long way from the edge of death to the theater of the living. The crowd did not dare leave the convocation hall. Restless, but also afraid of what might happen to them if they didn't bear witness to the ascension of Krovak, they remained in the hall, sweating and itching in their uncomfortable finery. An hour passed, then another, and a third was underway when a silent stroke of lightning blinded everyone, and a hot wind stirred the robes and gowns of the assembled court. Krovak had returned, with Belby in his arms. The corps of sergeants, who had been at ease, snapped to attention. Courtiers old and young struggled to their feet or smoothed their heavy ceremonial robes. Without a word of explanation, Krovak sat down on the throne. The emissary of the overlords leaned on the arm of the great chair, a hand over her tightly shut eyes.
"Excellency, we're here,"
said Krovak.
"Do your duty,"
he insisted. She inhaled. "People of Rath," she began in a small voice, "I ask you all to forgive my weakness. The overlords set me the task of finding a new ruler for Rath, and with due diligence I tried to find the best candidate. I didn't realize until this moment the search was a sham, that the choice had already been made by the overlords, even as I was being dispatched on my mission to Rath."
"Say what you came to say,"
said Krovak, growing impatient. Belby faced the audience. "I regret. What I'm compelled to say now, I give you the new Evankar Tharp." Krovak leaped to his feet.
"Who dares interrupt?"
Two figures cleaved through the crowd, Grevin Ilvek and the corps chief, Fura.
"Grevin, I'll have your head in an iron cage for this. I'll roast your brains over a slow fire, and even then, I won't let you."
"Save your threats, my lord,"
said Grevin.
There are more important matters to deal with.
The sergeants tried to bar his way, but Grevin easily broke their linked arms apart. More of the corps broke formation to box the hulking warrior in, but Krovax ordered them to let Grevin and the corps through.
Why aren't you withering on the floor?
Krovax demanded.
Your spine should be smoking by now.
You're not the only one who commands the control rod,
Grevin said.
What you order, another can countermand.
Nonsense! No one dares interfere with my will.
Fura stepped forward. He bowed slightly and smiled, showing long, feline teeth. I long looked forward to meeting you, he said. Grevin has told me of your activities.
Who are you?
Demanded Krovax. I am the one that chair belongs to. You, Krovax of Urborg, are a usurper. Krovax lowered his head. The flowstone around Fura's feet rippled in a series of tiny points, but none grew more than an inch, and none came close to harming him. The corps chief, in his turn, spread his hands wide. A stream of flowstone balls the size of Grevin's head burst from the walls and pounded Krovax. The last and largest ball struck him hard in the chest and drove Krovax backward over the arms of the throne. Belby leaped aside, staring at Fura in utter disbelief. The crowd jostled and elbowed each other for a better look at this unexpected challenge to Krovax. Those in front regretted their eagerness when the pavement beneath their feet erupted in a hedge of spikes. Dozens were impaled where they stood, and the ring of spikes completely walled off Fura and Grevin from the rest of the room. Krovax appeared from behind the throne. Blood from a cut lip flecked his once spotless white tunic.
You command flowstone well,
Krovax said, descending the shallow steps.
Who are you?
I thought you would have guessed by now. Grevin said you lacked imagination for anything but killing, but I hoped he was mistaken. He glanced at his giant companion. Grevin's a stout fighter, but he sometimes lacks discernment. Not in this case, it seems.
Enough chatter. Explain yourself.
Krovax stared hatefully at the corps man. Rather than a spoken reply, Fura began to change. His shoulders expanded, his legs and arms lengthened, his skull widened, and his features swelled and disappeared. In place of the pale, slender core, now stood a man with a sculpted body of impossibly perfect proportions. Taller by a head than Krovax, he exuded grace and power. His face was carved in such a way as to suggest wisdom and strength. The crowd spoke his name. Volrath! Belby was impressed. To simpler folk, Volrath might appear to be a god. Even as she thought this, many of the court went down on their knees and bowed their faces to the floor in abject reverence to their Evankar.
So you've come back.
Krovax said.
Why? To reclaim what's mine,
said Volrath.
You forfeited the throne when you abandoned it. I am the new Evankar.
He turned to Belby.
Tell him, Excellency.
Belby lowered her eyes and said, I am the emissary of the overlords of Phyrexia. I was sent here to appoint your successor.
That is no longer necessary. I have returned,
said Volrath.
You return to your own death,
Krovax shouted. The crowd cheered. Volrath! Hail Volrath! Krovax spat out at the crowd.
The next mouth to hail this pretender will breathe its last. You can slaughter them all, and it won't change the truth. I am Volrath. I am Evankar. You're just a corpse that hasn't lain down yet.
Krovax drew sword and dagger and advanced. Volrath, unarmed, reached out and drew Grevin's oversized sword. As Belby watched, Volrath enlarged himself to Grevin's size. Stop this! Stop this at once! Charging between the would-be combatants. Krovax tried to reach around her and cut at Volrath with his black-bladed sword. Belby caught the blade with her hand. The sharp edge bit through her duralumin bone. Krovax tried to tug his sword free, but she held on. Volrath whirled Grevin's broadsword around his head as if it were a light stave. With Krovax encumbered by Belby, he stepped sideways and thrust at the usurper. The emissary blocked his attack with her other hand. The blunt point of Grevin's weapon bit deeply into her palm, but her metal hand closed tightly and would not let the sword go. Volrath relaxed, letting go of the borrowed blade. Belby tossed Grevin's sword away. Krovax tried to wrench his weapon free, but Belby turned and broke his sword blade in two with a single blow of her bleeding right hand.
You are a formidable construction, but this intervention is ill-timed,
said Volrath.
There can't be two Evankars.
I don't propose there to be any more than one, Belby said, throwing the end of Krovax's blade to the floor. The crowd pressed against the fence and flowstone spikes, trying to see what was happening. Belby, her hands bleeding copiously, mounted the steps and seated herself on the throne. This is my last act as emissary, she announced. I will sit in judgment of a contest between Krovax and Volrath, and the winner shall be the sole rightful governor of Rath. Krovax hurled his sword hilt to the floor with acclaim.
Outrageous!
He roared.
I had your word. I would be named Evankar. I also object,
said Volrath more mildly.
I have been Evankar for more years than this usurper has lived. Why should I submit to anyone's judgment or to some ridiculous contest?
She addressed Volrath first. It is true, you are governor of this world, and during your reign the overlords were pleased with your rulership. However, when you abandon your post, pursue a personal revenge against Weatherlight and her crew, you forfeited all credit with our Phyrexian masters. The Hidden One himself directed me to come here and find a replacement. Frankly, I am interpreting my orders liberally to even allow this contest, but I am sure our masters would approve, she said. Her head swam and she tucked her bleeding, oil-streaked hands into her armpits. Consider it recognition of your past service that I allow you to clear your record of the stain of desertion. It was impossible to read Volrath. His face was a living mask, alive yet no more expressive than the statues in his private quarters. Volrath pondered her words, then bowed.
Your Excellency is most generous. I accept your proposal.
Krovax was boiling with barely contained rage. The walls, the ceiling closest to him, rippled and writhed under the force of his frustration. He turned his fearsome gaze from Belby to Volrath, and his outward anger subsided.
I see no problem,
he said to Belby.
This pathetic weakling presents no challenge to me. I will kill him, then I will kill you.
Grevin, having already picked up his sword, stood at Belby's right hand.
For the duration of the contest, I will defend the emissary, so that no unfair advantage will be gained by threatening her,
he said. So saying, he offered her a scrap of homespun bandana. She regarded Grevin's gift blankly until he tore the cloth in two and indicated she should use it to bind the wounds on her hands. The doors of the convocation hall were opened and the rearmost spectators were pushed out of the room by the corps of sergeants. An open oval space was cleared of carpet, flags, and bystanders. Krovax's sergeants withdrew in a body to the right wall. The fence of flowstone spikes was dissolved, and those unlucky people slain by Krovax's initial fury were quickly removed. Steel swords and shields of identical size and length were taken from two palace guards and provided to the combatants. Volrath pulled on a pair of scale mail gauntlets. Seeing this, Krovax did the same. He dropped the gold-edged mantle from his shoulders. Neither man wore any other armor. Volrath walked off a pace or two and started stretching and flexing his artfully carved muscles. Krovax called for wine and drank a goblet dry, watching his opponent preen before the crowd. Krovax dropped his goblet.
Time is short. Let's begin. I agree. What are the rules?
Said Volrath. Belby folded her bandage hands in her lap. There is only one rule. Win. Krovax promptly lashed out with a wide sideways cut. Volrath threw himself back and brought up his shield. Sparks flew as the blades met the polished buckler. Krovax bored in, slashing and thrusting and using his shield arm to slam against Volrath's. Volrath grew visibly taller, even as Belby watched. He moved so fast most people in the hall couldn't see his true motion, but Belby's enhanced eyes followed every move. Volrath's arm elongated as he thrust it forward. The tip slid off the top of Krovax's shield and kept going. An ordinary fighter would have run out of the arm by then, but Volrath's reach was preternatural. Krovax realized his danger and turned away just as the leading edge of Volrath's thrust clipped his left ear. He called on the floor to trip Volrath, but the flowstone waves broke over the former Evankar's ankles like water and didn't impede him. In turn, Volrath summoned another barrage of flowstone balls. Krovax was expecting them. Instead of liquefying them like his opponent, he batted them away with forceful commands. The skull-sized projectiles mowed down 5 onlookers. Volrath retracted his arm to more normal proportions and advanced. He feigned an overhand attack, but again with amazing swiftness switched the line of his cut to an underhand thrust. Krovax blocked with his shield and struck out with his booted right foot. The hobnails connected with Volrath's leg below the knee.
You're fast,
Krovax said, grinning.
but you don't have a true killer's instinct. I've killed more people in 1 year as Evankar than you have in your entire life, barbarian.
Volrath retorted.
You call killer instinct is merely a lust for death. I am above such feelings.
They traded 4 hard cuts that left both their blades deeply nicked. For the first time, Belby felt Volrath was concerned. He hadn't expected Krovax to last this long. Emboldened, Krovax lowered his head and shouted sharply. He jabbed at his opponent's legs and stomach. Volrath gave ground grudgingly, backing up 2 steps, advancing 1 with a counter thrust, then backing up 2 more. Behind Krovax, the floor humped up in a series of rounded semicircles. Krovax apparently didn't notice. Grevin nodded approvingly. Krovax's sword tip bounced off Volrath's shield. The latter executed a blinding pirouette, his blade coming edge-on at the side of Krovax's neck. He ducked, and his heel caught the nearest hump. With an expression of utter surprise, Krovax fell. Volrath let out a triumphant laugh and leaped. He landed astride the fallen Krovax. Up went the brightsword. Krovax vanished in a flare of white light. Volrath's blade went 3 inches into the floor. The flowstone softened, allowing him to recover, and his partisans in the crowd shouted warnings. He turned his head and saw Krovax materialize 4 feet in the air directly behind him. There was no time to parry or dodge. Instead, Volrath shrank. He contracted his body by a fifth. Krovax's sword raked down Volrath's back, laying open his skin. Glistening oil spattered across the front of Krovax's white tunic. Shrinking saved Volrath's life, but he had a painful wound from his left shoulder blade to his right hip. He dropped his hands to the floor and staggered forward on them. Grinning widely, Krovax tried trampling his foe into the floor. Flowstones splashed and flew as the men fought for control. Volrath rolled on his back. Krovax tried to overrun him and got a foot planted on his chest. The finely proportioned muscles in Volrath's legs uncoiled, hurling Krovax into the air. His feet didn't touch the ground for 5 yards, then he slammed into the tightly packed crowd. He was up in a flash, hacking and slashing at anyone within reach of his blade. Courtiers and soldiers alike climbed over each other to get out of the way, but he slew at least 10 before it became inconvenient to chase the others. Belby knew this wasn't just a pointless homicide. Krovax derived new strength from the death of others. He was refreshing himself in the midst of a duel by slaughtering innocent onlookers. His back wet with glistening oil, Volrath went to the foot of the throne. Belby could smell the crisp electric odor of the fluid. Volrath's broad shoulders heaved. He looked at Grevin Ilvek, standing with sword drawn at Belby's side.
How am I doing?
He asked wryly. Mouth to the flow hot lifts in the outer environs of the palace. Except for the occasional patrols, he saw no one. Guards marched past him without stopping, the men idly watching his painful progress. He reached the lifts and fell heavily into the closest one. It had been far too long since his last infusion. Without the dark energy to suppress them, his old injuries were slowly emerging again. The laboratory was a long way away. Despite his wounds, old and new, his first thought was to find Belby. Her life hung in the balance. He was certain Krovax would kill her once she had been proclaimed Evankar. "Convocation Hall," he said to the lift. The fleshstone flaps closed and the flowbot sank through the floor. The lift jerked to a stop. When the flaps lowered, he saw the antechamber was jammed with people. Everyone was craning their heads toward the open doors of the hall. Distantly, he heard the sounds of combat, punctuated by shouts. Urza grasped the leathery hide of the lift and dragged himself to his feet. If this was to be his last act, he wanted to enter standing and not on his knees. He wormed his way through the mass of gawkers. Some shrank from his fearful, swollen visage and let him pass. Others regarded him with pity and stepped aside. When Urza reached the inner edge of the crowd, the closely packed rank of guards and courtiers parted to reveal a wan and worried Belby, seated on the throne and guarded by the imposing Grevenil Vec. She was talking to another tall, muscular fellow with an improbably handsome face. Volrath. Urza recognized him from the statues around the stronghold. He had an awful wound across his back. The flesh exposed was gray, not red. Urza raised a hand in greeting. Heedless of the danger, Belby pushed past the tall, wounded swordsman and met the young sorcerer at the edge of the crowd. "Have I missed much?" he whispered. She lowered him to the floor. "You shouldn't have come. It isn't safe here." "Where is one safe on Rath?" Distracted, Volrath didn't see pinchers form out of the flowstone steps behind him. One pierced his right calf. He immediately banished them and, enraged, raised a wall of flowstone 6 feet high and 1 inch thick. He shouted so loudly the floor trembled and wall broke into a dense cloud of small pellets. Volrath flung his hands wide and the mass of pellets hurled themselves at Krovax. Up came the shield. With a sound like 1,000 nails punching through 100 tin plates, the pellets reduced Krovax's shield to a sieve. His tunic was shredded, and a score of pea-sized pellets buried themselves in his face. Scored and blasted, Krovax threw down his ruined shield. He crossed his forearms, fists tightly clenched. A growl rose from his throat. It began low and guttural, but grew louder and stronger as he focused his rage and pain. One by one, the flowstone pellets worked themselves out of his body, falling at his feet at a steady rate. Soon the floor around him was covered with hundreds of pellets. Urza tried to size up the situation. Volrath was an unknown quantity to him. He'd seen the ex-Evankar's quarters, heard commentary from people in the Citadel who knew him. He was cruel, ruthless, shrewd, and a man of unusual appetites. Compared to him, Krovax was a machine, soulless, utterly devoid of guilt or feelings of humanity. Volrath would expect to win because of his superior skills. Krovax thought he could prevail through brute force and a willingness to do anything to win. The battle would go on and on until sheer survival determined the winner. With his ability to renew himself with the lives of others, Krovax would ultimately win. Nothing Urza could do would help Volrath. Once the former Evankar was out of the way, retribution would inevitably fall on everyone else. Krovax's two-handed stroke tore the shield from Volrath's grasp. The dented buckler caromed off the wall. Both fighters were reduced to swords alone. Volrath assumed a sideways stance, the pose of a fencer rather than an infantry soldier. Krovax circled warily, trading occasional cuts and jabs. As he orbited outside of Volrath's reach, he glanced at Urza and betrayed surprise as seeing the young sorcerer alive. Volrath sidled forward a step when Krovax's attention strayed. His arm lengthened by 2 inches and he carefully bent his elbow to hide the new growth. Volrath started his lunge. His arm straightened, and with the velocity of a striking viper, he drove his blade at the junction of Krovax's right arm and chest. Krovax's eyes widened in alarm. He tried to backpedal out of danger, but his response was too slow. The nicked, dented blade flew at him. He brought his own sword up in a desperation parry, but the impetus of Volrath's lunge bore his hilt back against his own face. 30 inches of tempered steel slid along Krovax's arm. Volrath's lunge had succeeded, and the startled usurper seemed paralyzed by the realization of his imminent defeat. Time stretched out. The normal yellow gleam of the hall lanterns and the bright steel blade became purplish. Volrath's triumphant face fell. An unknown force was playing down the length of the onrushing blade. Someone was tampering with the fight, using old-fashioned magic to deflect his weapon. A horrified look on his face, Volrath watched the tip of his sword fall an inch, 2 inches, until it passed under Krovax's arm. Everything came together with a crash. Volrath and Krovax collided chest to chest. Volrath's sword swinging uselessly behind Krovax's back, Krovax's own blade was bent backward over his shoulder by the force of Volrath's attack. He twisted, dumping the overbalanced Volrath, at the same time punching him hard in the face with his free hand. Volrath hit the floor, his sword bounced free and skittered away into the crowd. Krovax threw himself on Volrath's back. He hooked his left arm around the man's chin and drew his head back, arching Volrath's back as if it were a longbow. The ragged edge of the sword came down to slice Volrath's taut throat. Volrath blocked the blade with his mailed hand. The wall of courtiers and soldiers dissolved to reveal a captain of the palace guard backed by a phalanx of his men. The captain's face was streaked with blood. "My lord! The rebels!" he cried. "They've barricaded themselves in the dream halls!" Belby was on her feet. She flung a hand at the straining pair of fighters. "Hold!" They continued to struggle. She appealed to Grevin. The Vec warrior did not move.
Declare a winner, or stand aside, Excellency,
he said. "You heard the captain," she said. "We must defend the citadel."
That is the job of the Evankar.
It all came down to this moment. Belby looked from face to face, searching for an answer. Grevin was impassive. Urtai smiled weakly, then sagged to the black pavement. Courtiers avoided her. Soldiers pretended to be busy readying themselves to fight the rebels. Finally, she looked down at Krovax. He had Volrath down, his head locked, his throat vulnerable. Only 4 mailed fingers prevented him from cutting Volrath's jugular.
Do your duty!
Krovax gasped. "Behold!" Belby cried. "Behold! The Evankar of Rath! Krovax!" The sergeants broke ranks and shouted their master's name. Most of the assembled notables joined in, though a good number quietly fled. "Let him up!" Belby said above the roar of the crowd.
He must die!
Krovax replied. "He's lost. His life is forfeit, but your first duty is to quell the rebels in your own fortress." Krovax agreed. He ordered his men to secure the former Evankar and place him under close guard.
Wrap him in chains of good steel.
Krovax said.
Hang him by his feet. Let no part of the body touch the structure of the citadel. Seat 10 men with bare swords around him. If the floor so much as trembles, strike off his head.
Volrath was buried under a pile of sergeants. He didn't resist, but they pressed him hard to the floor and wound chains around his legs. His hands were wrenched behind his back and chained together. A hood was cinched over his head. By the time Volrath was securely bound, the hall was almost empty. Guards and soldiers under Grevin's command had already marched off. The sergeants bore Volrath away. Krovax turned to Belby.
Excellency, this is a great day.
He dropped his sword and enfolded her roughly in his arms. Though she resisted, Krovax kissed her hard, smearing his sweat on her face as she stained him with glistening oil still oozing from her injured hands. Alone, lying on the floor a few feet away, Urtai smiled.